So, good morning everyone. It's good to be here again to study Revelation chapter 9. We'd like to, this is number 10 in the series. So we'd like to go firstly, surprisingly, to Isaiah chapter 2 to introduce this subject, because in the Word of God, it's in Revelation, the revelation is given by Jesus Christ to John the Beloved. And it's not a very pretty revelation of the work of mankind on the earth. And in that revelation, we have beasts, we have powers which are arrayed against God's ways of doing things. And these are mentioned in the book of Revelation, and God tells us through Jesus and through John, tells us the story just as it really is in his eyes, because his kingdom is based on love. And wherever there is the enforcement of a doctrine on other groups of people, where there is a kingdom which conquers by force and by cruelty and in the use of power, God tells you that that kingdom doesn't have an origin with him. It's not inspired, the work is not inspired by him that they do when they do that particular thing. Of course, there's individuals in the kingdom who are impressed by God and who are influenced by God to do some good works. But that when the kingdom is operating on those bases, then there's something wrong. Even with Israel, we know that when Israel took up the sword and conquered with the protection of God to some extent the nations around them, that was not the way God wanted it done. And so we want to see that in the revelation that we must look at these kingdoms and nations as they really are through God's eyes. And this is not very complimentary. So we'll begin with the book of Isaiah chapter 2 and read some things here which will help us to understand that in these last days it's a time when we really come to understand God's kingdom. So we go to verse 2 of Isaiah 2. And it shall come to pass in the last days, which is now, we're living in the last days. So this is a prophecy of this time, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains. Now, what is the mountain of the Lord's house? It's God's church, or God's kingdom that he is building through his people on the earth. And a mountain represents a kingdom. For instance, Babylon was a burning mountain in the book of Jeremiah. So when Jesus comes, he is as a stone cut out of a mountain without hands, who smites the image on the foot. The Daniel 2 image, of course. So let us see in this imagery that in these last days, people will have explained to them by those who God is teaching these truths, how God operates. So it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. So at the very last time, before Jesus comes, the truth will be given throughout the whole world about the coming kingdom that Jesus is going to establish based on truth and love. The principles of God's government. God is love. And that the kingdoms of this world and many of the religious organisations have not operated in the past according to these principles. And now the invitation goes forth to everyone in the earth to learn the ways of God, to learn how to operate according to God's ways rather than the terrible things that happened during the Dark Ages on the earth. So we are living in a time where the truth is available about how to operate God's ways in love, mercy and kindness. And this message is for everyone, no matter what religious background or whether there's no religion at all. These principles are open for all to see and to understand what God's kingdom is really like. Verse 3, and many people shall go up and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So in the last days, we will see that God's people, wherever they are scattered all over the earth, will be those who will teach the truth at the end of time. And they will warn people that God's kingdom operates on a different platform to the kingdoms of this world. And you think of all the misery, those who understand history, the misery of the Dark Ages, the misery of wars, the misery of violence that has taken place upon this earth. And the mountain of the Lord's house, his people are to operate on a totally different platform, the platform of truth and love being the prevailing power. And Jerusalem here is symbolic, and Jacob is symbolic too in this prophecy. But we're not going to look specifically at this prophecy today. Just going to bring out some thoughts. And he shall judge among the nations. And that's Jesus will judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people. And we can expect to be rebuked in these last days if we are going to enter into the heavenly kingdom, which is based on truth and love. And he will rebuke people through his human instruments. He'll rebuke them through the word, and through the human instruments, through the Holy Spirit, in all different ways, and people from every walk of life, from every religion, from every ideology. And shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. In other words, their weaponry they will put away and pursue a peaceful course of action. A peaceful course of action. And their spears into pruning hooks. So once again, a peaceful course of action as they learn about the true God. And Jesus is that representative, authentic representative of God's character. And when we study that life of Jesus, we see what God is really like. And that is the pattern that everyone in the world is to gain an insight into before Jesus actually comes to this earth. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come you and let us walk in the light of the Lord. So this is the time in which we live. Let's go now to Isaiah 11, and we see the same thought brought out in verse 9. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. So among God's people there will be no destructive work that they will do. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. So that root is Jesus, who's come once, but through his people he will also be a root of Jesse in these last days to represent his people, represent his character. Yes, so let's now turn to the book of Revelation, and here we see the fifth trumpet, and this is a woe trumpet. And woe means that it's a worse judgment upon the Roman Empire than the other judgments. Now, it's God who holds back the winds of strife on the earth. But when the people are not operating God's ways, they're operating in their own ways, then he cannot protect them to the same degree. And so gradually, as in these cases, as we'll see as we go through this chapter, this protection is withdrawn more and more from the Roman Empire. Which is where most of God's people were. So the first four trumpets were attacks upon the Roman Empire, which we were looking at last week. Now we're on to the fifth, and we can expect that we're going to carry on from where we finished last week, and that's in actual fact what happens. Here we have another attack, but from a different source. And the information that we have in Revelation 9 shows us where that is coming from. But we want to build on some of this information now. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth. And to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. So what is this bottomless pit? The bottomless pit is an abyss, or a waste place, a desert place, deserted or desert place, uncultivated place, something along these lines. And we should expect that the great powers and the great nations that are there in history about this time will be represented in the Bible when they come in contact with where God's people are. So this is about the area of where the scriptures were mostly located and the effects on the people of that time, so that when they saw these things happen and then read about them too, for those who had the opportunity to read the scriptures, which wasn't many, that the word would get around about this matching with the book of Revelation. So this star falls from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months, and that their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. So here we have a prophetic period too of 5 months. And these 5 months in prophetic time, each month is 30 days, times 5 equals 150 years, is how long that these people would make these insertions into the Roman Empire in their first stage. So who were these people? They came from the waste place, from the desert place, and it was the Saracens, or the Arab people, from the desert country. They came against the Roman Empire, particularly the Greek part of the Roman Empire, and they were led by Mohammed. In the beginning, and the second leader of them was Abu Bakr. Abu who took over from Muhammad in 632 AD, and we'll go to verse 4. Where it says, "And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads." So when Abu Bakr, who took over from Mohammed to attack the Roman Empire, when he began his work, he told his soldiers This is reading from the book Daniel and the Revelation by Uriah Smith. After the death of Mohammed, he was succeeded in the command by Abu Bakr in AD 632, who, as soon as he had fairly established his authority and government, gathered the Arabian tribes for conquest. When the army was assembled, he instructed his chiefs on methods of conquest. When you fight the battles of the Lord, this is a quote from him, acquit yourselves like men, without turning your backs, but let not your victory be stained with the blood of women or children. Destroy no palm trees, nor burn any fields of corn. Cut down no fruit trees, nor do any mischief to cattle, only such as you kill to eat. When you make a covenant or article, stand to it, and be as good as your word. As you go on, you will find some religious persons who live retired in monasteries and propose to themselves to serve God that way. Let them alone, and neither kill them nor destroy their monasteries. And you will find another sort of people that belong to the synagogue of Satan. To them who have shaven crowns, be sure to cleave their skulls and give them no quarter till they either turn Mohammedans or pay tribute. So that was the decree of Abu Bakr when he began his part of the war against the Roman Empire, the Greek portion of it. And this is recorded in the 4th verse, that these people would make this decree. Verse 4, and it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. So this was not directed against the people of God who lived in the Roman Empire. It was directed more against the actual priests and people like that of the Catholic Church, because in the Catholic Church there was idol worship, but in the Mohammed ruling there was not supposed to be idol worship. So these people came from the wasteland, the desert place. It's said that their coming was like the smoke coming out of a great furnace, and it was like locusts upon the earth. And locusts are a fit emblem of the people from the desert wastes. And the smoke is a sign of the teaching of Mohammed when they came, that it was forced upon the people, and the people did not want it. But if they resisted the incursions, they would certainly die by the hands of these people. So that is the basis in which we can understand that this was the Saracens who were led by Muhammad, and then Abu Bakr, and then a whole series of people after that who would also continue the same work. And this work went on for a long, long time. Now, how did this come about? Well, when we come to about the year 600 or so, 627 AD, I think it is, we had a situation where there was a Persian king, and his name was Chosroes. Chosroes or Chosroes. Chosroes, I think it is. And he basically took most of the territory of the Greek part of the Roman Empire. He conquered that. And the Roman Empire and the emperor was then confined to Constantinople. Constantinople, which was the capital in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And Constantinople became known as Istanbul when it finally fell to the Saracen people. So there was this Persian king. Now the emperor of Constantinople had had all his lands taken off him, and they were basically stuck in Constantinople himself by this Persian king. So he marched his troops and took this Persian king by surprise, a long, long way from his base of operation. And his name was, I've got it written down here, Heraclius. Heraclius. And he marched his troops through and he attacked Sosro, and he defeated him, basically defeated him. Soslo survived, but he was murdered soon after. But Heraclius didn't become strong while this was going on. He couldn't hold the empire because at that time the Arabs then attacked and they took all the territory that the Persian king had had. Now the Persian king and Muhammad were against each other too. And so Muhammad, who was the weakest force, was very weak at the start. He just waited until these two powers would exhaust themselves fighting against each other. And then Muhammad attacked and gained success immediately. And so for a long, long time, these incursions kept coming. Now, let's read what it says in verse 5 again. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when it striketh a man. So they never actually captured Constantinople in the beginning, but they kept coming in. They would raid, they would take the possessions of the people, they would take whatever they wanted, they would kill a lot of people, and then they would go back again. So they never actually beat the Roman emperors. Now let's just make some room here on our board before we continue on. And this history is a sad history. And the more I study history, the more I see that the history of the human race is a sad history, because the human race has not learned the lessons that Jesus sought to teach of love your enemies, do good, and be kind to others. The whole of Europe was a series of wars. People are invading other people, people fighting. And then we have the Arab people coming in too, and they did the same type of thing. So that's why, personally, I like to follow Jesus Christ, because he is a person who is both God and man, and we can trust that his teaching is the most powerful teaching. And his teaching is a teaching of love, kindness and goodness. And that is why I recommend to taste of the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. But the nations of the earth have not operated like that. Okay, so let's continue now. We want to go to look at this 150 years. And want to understand that better before we close. Verse 6. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. So it's pretty sad, isn't it, that the lives of people were made so miserable by these incursions into the Roman Empire, that people wished that they would die rather than face what was coming all the time, coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. You imagine that your house had been destroyed, your crops had been destroyed, then you had built your house again, you'd put in your crops again, and then they arrived again and took everything they wanted and maybe burnt your house again. Because the command to not hurt the grass or the earth was not held to for very long at all. Let's go to verse 7. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. And on their heads were, as it were, crowns like gold, and their faces as the faces of men. So when the Arabs went into battle, because remember that the Arabs were great horsemen. And they were the best horsemen in the world at that time. And they could ride like on the side of the horse and all that sort of thing. The Arab horse is quite a famous horse today too, very spirited horse. And they had really good control of their horses. And they could make war on their horses. And they could shoot from their horses. So the symbolism of locusts is carried through in this verse 7. and on their heads as it were crowns like gold. So they had long hair, and underneath their, or on top of their hair, was their turban. And it was like to the prophet who was looking at it, because he wasn't familiar with these people, he saw a vision of this happening. He saw it as being like crowns of gold. And their faces were as the faces of men. And this is a serious type of face that was there. Verse 8, and they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions. So they were pretty fierce people back then. And they had breastplates as it were breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots, of many horses running to battle. So we have this picture of horses again, and their breastplates. It was known that Muhammad, when he was in battle, the second major battle of his, that 700 of his men had breastplates when they went into battle. It's a known fact. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. Here we have this prophetic time of 5 times 30 equals 150 years, each day for a year in Bible prophecy. So see Ezekiel chapter 4 verse 6, or Numbers chapter 14 verse 34, if you want confirmation that that is one of the Bible keys to understanding prophetic time. We've talked about that in more length before, so I'm not going to go into that this time. But if you go into the Daniel studies, you'll see that this is represented there. And they had, so they had power to hurt men. This is an important point to remember. They had power to hurt men. And to hurt men, as it says, as a scorpion stings. So a scorpion, when it stings, doesn't normally kill the person, but wounds them. And they had this power to hurt men for 150 years. But they couldn't conquer Constantinople. So Constantinople, the capital, was safe during that time. That's where the Roman emperor was. Okay, so now we need to know, when does this prophetic time begin? That is the next thing we should be looking for, and we need to find a clue to where it begins, that we can build a foundation to understanding it, because there's 2 prophetic times in this chapter which teach us who the 5th trumpet is more clearly. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue has his name Apollyon. So the word Abaddon or Apollyon means destroyer. So they had a king over them who became a destroyer. And he was a destroyer of the Roman Empire and some of God's people in there, we can be sure, were destroyed as well. So when did they get a king over them? Because for most of the time that we've been talking about up till now, from when around 627 AD, 628, until when they got a king. And the first king of the Arabs or Turks or Saracens was Othman, spelled in different ways in different places, but that's probably the easiest one to remember. And he was the first one who was able to unite the people together as a king. Previous to that, it was an association of various tribes who operated together under a leader. But the leader was not like an absolute leader. He ruled by consensus with the leaders of each tribe, of those powerful tribes. But at a certain time, they had a king over them who organised everything. And this king was Othman. So, when did this King Othman make his first attack? The date is the 27th of July, 1299. So right from basically 650 years, there was no king. There was just a combination of tribes working together. And this is true if you go to Afghanistan today, for instance, you hear that there's certain areas where tribal leaders are in control. And to do anything in those areas, you have to get the consent of those kind of tribal leaders. So this is common in those parts of the world. So the beginning date when they had a king was the 27th of July, 1299. And if we then add 150 to that, we come to another significant date. So let's do that. This is the time when the Arabs would hurt men. And so we get a 9 here, we get a 4 here, we add 1, we get a 4 here and a 1 here. 1449 is another significant date in this prophecy. And it's a very clear prophecy. So I think we're almost out of time. So we'll stop here and we'll continue with the second part of this prophecy and see what event took place in 1449, because we won't rush through this, otherwise you'll lose the effect of the accuracy of this prophecy. So I want to make it clear that God is a God of love and truth, and that we can find that love and truth in Jesus, but in the kingdoms of this world we will find a certain amount of it, depending on what the king is like or what the kingdom is like. We find a certain amount. But God is going to set up a kingdom based on his principles. And those of us who want to be in that kingdom, we should be looking to learn God's ways. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you, despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be like your Father which is in heaven. And what did Jesus say to Peter? Put that sword back in its place. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Every one of the beasts of Daniel 2 and Revelation, and every one of the powers in Daniel and in Revelation that operated and enforced their kingdom upon others, or enforced their religion upon others by the use of the sword, they have all gone downhill. And that is the reason, because he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. When is mankind going to learn that simple lesson that Jesus taught and learn to operate according to the principles that Jesus laid out in the Sermon on the Mount? And I would appeal to all of us to operate by the teachings of Jesus, because that is the key understanding that we can have to operate in a way in which we will receive eternal life at the end of our life, and that eternal life can begin right now. So that's why I read that passage from Isaiah, that the swords should be turned into ploughs, and the, what was it? The something into pruning hooks. Can't remember the other thing. So spears into pruning hooks. So let's do that in our lives. Let's turn to the Lord with our whole hearts. Give up the ways of violence. Give up the ways of war. Give up the ways of hatred. There's room for every religion in the world to have its place according to the dictates of the conscience. And so if someone wants to be a communist, let them be a communist. If someone wants to be a Hindu, let them be a Hindu. If someone wants to be a Muslim, let them be a Muslim. If someone wants to be a Christian, let them be a Christian in its various phases. And let God decide the outcome of the choices of everyone. The one thing we shouldn't do is to force our ideas upon others. And so the Bible doesn't support the idea of enforcement of one religion upon another, but that everyone has a clear choice to make according to their understanding of what is truth, and that we should live at peace with each other. So with those thoughts we shall stop, and we'll carry on with this prophecy in the next session. Thank you.